and should have Amy's voice as well. Okay, cool.
Yes.
So back to the recording. So we left off at talking about we said we were going to get through like 30 pages worth. We're up to page 10, so good stuff so far. What were we talking about in the break again, Ames? What did we just start?
We started off talking about how people
Tissues.
write from real life.
Yes.
But also about we ended up talking about steampunk and settings and stuff like that, and how it's not really relevant that you have a Samaflange, but it's how that Samaflange affects the rest of the play.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't matter. Like steampunk might mean all sorts of things, but at its core, it's like a steampunk or cyberpunk or fantasy or whatever. But if it's steampunk or cyberpunk or whatever punk, you want to have something at its core that talks to the punk part, i.e. rebelling against the status quo. It's reductive, but you get the idea. And then the Steam thing comes separately. That's the flavor text. So it doesn't matter if it's a Samaflange or, like you say, a Samaflange or a Keytar 5000 or a whatever, or the sword of my great grandfather or whatever. It's more about, because what's going to happen is the setting will encourage a certain type of character, a person or place or creature.
But at the base, the character is still a person.
Yes.
It doesn't matter where you stick that character. They're still going to be a grafter or a flighty type person, floozy or.
I think the key part there, I'm going to jump in because the person, quote unquote person, doesn't have to be a person at all. It could be a creature, it could be a beast, it could be a demon, it could be a robot, whatever. But the key is, the reason why we're describing them as a person is because they need to be relatable. If a creature, if a bad guy, if a antagonist in your adventure is relatable, then you're onto a bit of a winner, because the fact that they're relatable means they're memorable, and the fact that they're memorable means your players are going to have a good time. So,
I mean, it makes me think of like a lot of robots or cyborgs and stuff like that. You could have a very boring character, but the most interesting characters who are cyborgs or robots have their own personality. You see that even with, I mean, I'm probably quoting from Mandalorian. Your favorite robot in Mandalorian is IG-11, where he doesn't per se have a personality. He has programming that makes him seem like he has a personality. But he's still a cool character because he's got personality. It doesn't matter that he's a robot. He's just that person.
His personality, IG-11 is an interesting example because he's not like the main bad guy, and that's kind of what we're talking around the issue here, especially in the context of these books, is that we want your main bad guy, your Molech the Reaper in the case of Altai Keep here, or in Failspeak Gorge you have Vor the Voracious. Say this is in the second adventure. Now we did play this one, I remember that one. Vor the Voracious was inspired very much by Resident Evil and the idea of having a tyrant or a big monster or something that's going to continue to fight you over and over again. Less about, so actually that's interesting because it's less about the character and making it relatable and more about making it unrelatable because it's so relentless. There is a relatable character in this adventure as well, the ghost of Ludikai Cheiron, the owner of this mine, I think, if I remember right. And also this is the introduction of when I started my love-hate affair with introducing gnomes to the setting. I think I believe in the very first draft of this, that isn't in this version, although may have made it into it, in the very, very first draft of this, and probably in the playtest game that we played, they were dwarfs, not gnomes, because dwarfs are always cool. We can't go wrong, and it's about a mine, so why wouldn't you have dwarfs in there? But over time, in the context of our campaign, we found gnomes became this interesting point, and we had this really interesting thing that then tied into the adventures in Mercassa, where they linked together. You had these kind of dour religious people linked with these kind of bright sprightly gnomes, and between the two of them it was like two great tastes that work well together. Again, there's something more about the peoples interacting. It's less about the setting and the specifics, although the idea is that like you've got these ancient like paladins of order and these kind of inventive gnomes, and they're kind of smushing together to make this kind of steampunky thing. There's an idea behind the setting, but it's more about the people, the mad gnomish inventors, the over the top paladins, and everything in between. So there's some real interesting stuff in there that's not really borne out of the technology or whatever.
I think also you're kind of branching into here where races become a thing.
Yeah.
So, for example, you think dwarves, you think mining, you think hard workers, you think sturdy, steadfast kind of people.
Yeah.
And those tropes speak into how those characters are created. You went further on to becoming more inventive, more tinkering kind of people. They are inherently more gnomish from
Yeah.
the tropes that you get traditionally. And I think possibly you could just have had, you ended up with gnomish dwarves, but that was the example that allowed people to create those characters in their brains. You
This
could
is
have
what,
just said,
yeah.
it's an interesting thing that you say, don't set your settings so hard and fast that it's the be all and the end all, but you can utilize those tropes in order to understand. I mean, have a steampunk setting, but that's it. That's all you're saying about it. This
Pretty
is a
much.
steampunk setting, or this is a gnomish person, which means inherently they're small, they're tinkerers, they have a lot of springs,
This is why I call it a love-hate relationship, because over time I grew sour to the reductive idea of race as character. This is it's 2021, and there's so many places. This has now happened in 5th edition that there's a lot of talk in 5th edition now, but Dungeon World as a game setting, because it's this love letter to classic D&D. It in itself was quite reductive. It was quite, as a system, it was quite behind. We've got these amazing these amazing fluid ideas in other Powered by the Apocalypse games of gender and identity and whatnot. Apocalypse World, the very first Apocalypse World, was absolutely cracking with it. You've got the idea of a battle babe, and that is a title that is not linked to gender, and all the other ones. And you had Monster Hearts, which really dealt with that in an absolutely cracking formula, of that Buffy the Vampire Slayer kind of coming to terms with your own identity in your awkward teenage years, and you're also a monster, what the world would consider as a bad thing, a monster. And Dungeon World did the same. Is like, well, here's an orc. Orcs go rah. Orcs are always savages and do this and that. And that is, like I say, that feels quite reductive. But what I've noticed is the glut of people, hopefully myself included over time, I don't know, but what people did with Dungeon World as a setting is they really took it to town. So you had all sorts of different places where it was like different varieties. You had Grim World and I don't know, Pirate World and all sorts of random stuff back in the day, which would then kind of run with these settings and take them beyond that traditional fantasy, you're in a dungeon fighting a dragon type tropes. And that was what was really nice to see.
It's come on leaps and bounds, no question of kind of that sort of thing. But you still, for me, I'm probably more outside the community than you are, but those tropes still exist. And it does, yes, we're in 2021 and we should be fluid and identifying with the rest of the world. And I'm probably maybe might get a bit of backlash from saying this, but
oh boy,
no, equally, those tropes still allow you to form a character in your head even for beginners, say. So yes, it's reductive and not very forward thinking in the rest of the world, but it still has its uses.
Yes, it is. I can't disagree, honestly. I can't entirely disagree that there are some fictional monsters treated as monsters is reductive, but they're also an important touchstone when you're starting a campaign. If everyone's on the same boat, we talked about this with Minotaurs earlier, arguably it's the same story, right? So if everyone knows what a gnome is, then we can start from the same touchstone and get to speed more quickly. I toyed with this idea over time. I changed, and I think this will probably turn up as the book. If you're reading the book from start to finish and trying to find the story will shift, because at one point I stopped calling them gnomes and started calling them Nulgi. I called them the race, a social race of Nulgi. They were the underground dwellers. I guess if it was a D&D, it'd be like something like the people who live in the Underdark, with which there are gnomes, there are dwarves, there are elves, whatever, right? And they all have their own sub-names, like Drow and Duergar and whatnot. But the idea is that I wanted to get away from that exact idea. And I said, well, what if there was someone who lived underground and had that culture of being a tinkerer, but they in themselves were an elf, and they were friends with a dwarf? And that led to some interesting stuff. But it also I found that I got pushback in my own groups, because people, especially when I started doing a new playtest with a different person, different people, different groups, different playtest groups, I found that there was that loss of like, well, okay, so what's a Nulgi again? What's that? How does that work? Don't you just mean gnome? And it's like, well, no, I want to try and do it a different way. And they're like, oh, okay, but you didn't get there quite as quickly. Yeah, maybe it was the wrong group for the playtest. Maybe I should have tried harder. Maybe we should have pushed that more. But at the end of the day, there's a conversation to be had there. I'm not knocking myself. Like, it is what it is, and it's there. And that's kind of, again, I want to put this patron stuff back in the forefront because, you know, there's interesting stuff there, but it's not going to be perfect. And
the thing is, you could equally blame yourself for not trying hard enough, not having that conversation, etc., etc. But you could equally blame. I don't want to spin it in a negative light. You could equally blame the people that you're playing with that they're not being forward thinking enough. Do you know what I mean? So it's a changing culture. We've still got to change to be slightly different than we were before.
Yeah.
Some people may like it. Some people may not.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about society in general.
Yeah, we're not here to have a full I mean, you know, a white guy and girl living in the middle of the UK. We're not the people to have this conversation. And I hope that, like, I do mention this in the right back in the principles, you know, make the cast diverse. You know, don't just default to your all English, all racial class. Don't make it all just fancy European town. Even if my stuff feels like that way, maybe sometimes I don't hit the mark, but, you know, you can mix it up. That's what you're there for. Do stuff that I don't know about that you can introduce and throw it out there. Get it out in the world. Throw it on Twitter. Throw it on Patreon. Wherever you Itch.io's great for that. Drive for RPG. Yeah. You know, get and that stuff out there and show me. I want to see it. I'd love to see stuff that was inspired by it that goes further. Because,
well, that was the point.
You can do it. You, the person watching this, can definitely do it. I know that for a fact.
But also, it's not just about, you know, if you have got an idea that you think would make a cool setting, etc., and you know, middle class white guy from the middle of the UK doesn't know about that, throw it as an idea because it's something that can be researched, it can be looked into. Yeah, you might not get it right the first couple of times, but it's still an outlet. It's still something different to be played with.
Definitely, absolutely, definitely. Yeah, let's
you know.
I'm gonna draw the line just because it's like we can talk about this all day and it's not the right subject. I want to kind of reminisce on everything that's going on here. Again, it is interesting in as much as it's a product of the time. 10 years ago, these conversations were not being had as much, and now they are. So this is definitely something worth looking into and thinking about. So there you go. Bear that in mind. I will draw on this very quickly though, which is on this page. This is my Failspeak Gorge was the oops, sorry, let's zoom that out. Failspeak Gorge was technically the first Patreon release, I think. Or maybe I feel like it was the second, but I can't remember what the first was. Maybe these two are in the wrong way round. I feel like Trouble in the Kesty came first. But either way, what I want to draw attention to is the fact that in Failspeak Gorge, under loot, one of my first patron rewards, my goals, was to hit £25 a month. And I got it. I got it straight away. And I was going to do an Elixir of Invention magic item in the next patron adventure, which is coffee. Still relying on it to this day. And there it is.
Technically, your first, so I've just looked it up, your first release was Failspeak Gorge.
Yeah, interesting.
Your second release was Trouble in
Nekesti, yeah. So they are not in quite the same order as what I've had there.
No.
However,
go on, carry on.
No, go on. You can't find.
I can't find. I want to say Alt-Right Valley. It's not.
Yeah, but it kind of is.
First one in the book.
That's right. Alt I Keep didn't come out as a patron release. Like I say, it was kind of my number 0. I wrote it as a kind of tester and because I was interested because of being creative and doing all that, so I had it to hand and I liked it, but it never actually came out. It came out, I wrote it in something like November or December of 2012. When's that first release, Ames? When was Failspeak Gorge?
January 2014.
2014. It was 2014. So I wrote Alt I Keep in December 2013. And it was just there as a writing exercise mostly, but I enjoyed it and I liked it and it fit the bill that came later. So it's, in my mind, it kind of made it as a prototype, a session 0, if you like, a 0 release that never actually made it to Patreon, but I did like it. And that's why Alt I Keep is where it is. Incidentally, the reason why these are in the order they are is when I've recorded these in, I released the PDFs by month. and I put them out, and when I've copied them into this adventure, I've simply taken the months. So what's happened is the monthly releases are sorted alphabetically, not necessarily chronologically. So F for Fellspeak Gorge, then T for Sanguine Forest, and then TR for Trouble in the Kesty is what's happened there. And then Stench and Nosyiad was a following month. So that's why they are in a slightly different order than release. They are alphabetical order by month. Luckily, I got a lot less productive over time, so that won't be less of a trouble as we go on, but we'll come back to that. So, Sanguine Forest. Sanguine Forest was a fun one. Sanguine Forest, I don't think we did the same, but I did do this with, you remember Katie, who we played games with occasionally?
Yeah.
My friend in Guildford. So, Katie and I played this. Her character is mentioned in here, if I remember right. I've just noticed there's a nasty block there that shouldn't be in there, so I have to change that later.
And there's one further down as well.
And there is one further down as well. Yes, thank you for that, Ames. Yeah, very good. And also, see, this is what I'm saying, is case in point that this is going to be a good opportunity. That this should have a title of monsters. This should be on the same line as that. And so there's a lot of messing about that I can do here, which is a result of copying them from their previous format into these ones. But the Sanguine Forest is an interesting one. This was based off of me and Katie doing a couple of adventures, because I know she didn't join up with our group as often, so sometimes we do like a one shot or a two shot, or like a one or two player thing. And she had a ranger, she had like an elfin ranging character, so her stuff kind of got folded into the greater Macassar setting, in my mind at least, but for the context of her playing, it was just part of this. But there was some interesting stuff. Sanguine Forest also had this interesting thing with the Myth and the Court. The Myth and the Court was like, it's a long bit of writing, and technically it's a custom move, but in reality what this writing was me talking about my own feelings. It's a very personal thing, which is more about, you've been invited, like my stuff had started doing well, and I was struggling with that sense of success, at least in terms of people liking it and sharing it and talking about it. My stuff was starting to be talked about. I was struggling with the idea of being talked about, and I wasn't sure what that would mean, and I wasn't sure if that would translate to all this talk of success. And it's like, well, for what? For a few pounds here and there? What does that mean? Can I be a writer now? Is this going to work? I didn't know. I still don't know. But that's what the Myth and the Court is all about. It's an analogy for me. I'm talking about what I can.
It's also a kind of keystone to what was also happening in your life, because not only your writing, but other things were happening that were, there were some major differences in 2014.
Yes and no. I don't think there was so much different in 2014. At the start of 2014, thank you very much.
No, 2013.
Wait, what? Did I get No, we didn't get together in 2013, did we?
Yeah, we did.
Did we?
Yeah.
Oh, bloody hell. Did we?
Because you wrote The Flowers was one of your first releases.
No, Flowers came later. This is what I'm saying. Six Flowers came much later. Six Flowers is here, all the way over in page 84.
Six Flowers is still 2014.
What month of 2014, though?
September 2014.
That was for our first anniversary, yeah.
Oh, was it? Yeah, it was our first anniversary.
I wrote that for our first anniversary, yeah.
Yeah, so we did still get...
And it's one of the shortest ones, so again, blame Amy for that. It's literally just... But there you go, yeah. Six Flowers was... I gave you a handful of... a collection of flowers. I wrote a collection of flowers, so it's like six different...
We're getting ahead of ourselves, but...
Yeah, well, like it's a good one to come to be fair, because it directly relates to you. But yes, okay, so you're right.
In late 2013, things were switching up for you quite a lot.
Yeah.
And I suppose that sort of little ode to yourself was allowable.
Well, there was uncertainty, certainly, yeah. A lot of uncertainty at that point. It was interesting, yeah. So let's go back to Sanguine Forest, yeah. Yeah, so that was very much an aside one, and I do like that, The Wood That Wouldn't Die. I like that little poetic title. That needs to be a bullet point as well.
Stop giving your work.
I can't help it. I mean, it's good to know, but I'm not going to go back and check this video, so whatever. Again, see, there's a good opportunity to add a few more adventures, a few more treasures. I guess I call it loot sometimes and treasure otherwise, don't I? That was loot, but this is treasure.
That's okay. Yeah. It depends on the narrative of the thing. I mean, that one, the Sanguine Forest, is a little bit more romantic than. Sorry,
yes.
I'm sort of attributing treasure to being a more romanticized type other than loot. Loot is very what's the word? it's a generic term, but treasure is very much more romanticized. This feels much more like a romanticized piece of work than
more
and
personable.
like you said, you've written more stuff in it. It's more that way inclined.
Yeah.
Whereas I'm on a boat is all about loot. It's fun. It's silly. It's what you get at the end of it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Not that Sanguine Forest isn't light-hearted, but yeah, there's an element to that. That's interesting, yeah. And there's a lot of questions in this one, in as much and less. There is less of a significant like character doing it. This is more personable about what's going on to the character, and that's born out of the playtesting that was more one-on-one, I would say as well.
Yeah.
So that's another interesting little thing. Not that it wouldn't necessarily work with larger groups, but that's what it was originally designed around. So yeah, that's interesting.
It's nice that well, maybe it might be Dungeon World Limited. I don't think it is. I think it's nice that because D&D can become very you play, you get loot, you go home kind of thing.
Yeah,
whereas
monster of the week.
If you've got a more personal connection with your character, it depends. Some people might have a more personal connection with their character every time they play D&D, but smaller systems like Dungeon World allow you to have that connection and have that smaller team. You know, it's not 6 people in a party, it's you and the GM or you and 2 people. So those personal relationships come out more often.
And in terms of the not quite what you're talking about, but related, then the relation between the player and the character is probably more intimate in something like Dungeon World, because there's less mechanics. There's less things to fall back on, and therefore if you want to get the most out of the system, you can't fall back and rely on that idea of I'm going to look at my sheet and remind myself what my character might do in the situation. You have to think about it and narrate that out and play that out in a way that makes sense.
It's embodying your character. It's like harping back to the dramatic side of me. It's there's a
an
where you become
side.
Your character.
Yeah.
You become your character rather than you playing off a bunch of numbers that's on your character sheet.
Yes.
And I think probably the best games are a mix of the two, depending on the person that's playing it. Either have more numbers, less character, or more character, less numbers. You know, it's a sliding scale.
For what it's worth, I 5th edition certainly pushes that scale more towards the character side and less from the numbers side.
Absolutely.
Possibly as a reflection of the fact that 4th was way in the numbers side.
Yeah.
But that's fine. I mean, again, we can play a numbers game from Amy and I play Warhammer regularly enough. Like, we'll happily crack out a game like that. But sometimes you want to play something different, and usually you want to get the people involved. You know, you want to get character stuff going involved. Let's talk about Trouble in the Kesty briefly. I like Trouble in the Kesty. It's our first instance of High Templar Logan. High Templar Logan was Tim's character, my good friend Tim Dennett's character. Tim has been involved with. If you want to talk about Mikasa, you want to talk about Tim, because aside from so we've talked about Umberto and how Umberto became Green Scar. What we haven't talked about is where Mikasa, which is like the 3rd of 4 continents, fits into that. The 4th continent, Chalcedon, is interesting because it's probably the most generic of the 4, but it's also the one that's kind of a response to the other 4. Chalcedon's often set up as the bad guy, like especially in Green Scar. So that's kind of where Chalcedon kind of is, especially in these early ones. But Mikasa, which is the default setting in a lot of these early ones, certainly the first 2 we've talked about here, Nekesti and Sanguine Forest, first 3, and Failspeak Gorge. High Templar Logan was Tim's character. He was a Templar. I can't remember who made it. There was a Templar character class that someone had made and put on Drive for RPG. I apologise. I can't remember. It was about, like I said, it was 2014, so it was 7 years ago. So I cannot remember who wrote the original Templar thing. However, thank you for that, because Tim enjoyed it immensely. I'll paraphrase what it meant. It was a paladin, but by way of more of a witch huntery inquisitor, former wrathful mob kind of thing. So Logan the Templar was a much more personable, interrogative type of character than your traditional paladin might be, and not as well armoured. Also lent into the idea of a witch hunter over a armoured paladin, which is where we started to get this blending of like, oh well, gnomes can make guns, so maybe your people are linked to the gnomes. Maybe the gnomes came from the mountains to the north and started working with the Templars, and maybe that was an interesting thing. That's where that started to come from. So Templar Logan gets a lot of shout outs. He even gets a name dedicated after him called Logansfell after he died, but we don't know if he died or not, because we stopped playing the campaign, so we just sort of left it as a to be continued. But it's always fun to come back to Logan as this kind of key character. He is very much a character within a player who became a character in the game. And that's what's going on here. Nekesti was one of the first adventures he was involved in. Pretty much by the numbers, it's a strange, isolated, kind of Eastern European-y, Russian-y type of town. You've got a magistrate who's up to no good, Magistrate Kalaref. That's probably stolen from World of Warcraft. I don't know where that name came from. He's your personable or not bad guy. What Dungeon World always does, which is nice, is they talk about what's the instinct. What's the one thing that a monster, be it a direwolf or a bat or a magistrate or a demon prince, what's their instinct? What's the one thing they want to do that is going to cause trouble for the players? Not necessarily the things they will do the most, but the thing they will do that will cause trouble from the players. So this magistrate wants to solidify his power. That could be bad news for the players.
I can't remember, especially back then. Did you tell us what those instincts were?
Oh, no.
No.
From a player's perspective, you shouldn't see any of this.
No.
That's an explicit GM rule in Dungeon World, is you never speak the name of the move. All these red bullet points here, especially ones about monsters, you should never see them. I mean, it happens, but you shouldn't, I shouldn't say, okay, it's Magistrate Kalaref's turn, he's going to disappear into the crowd. I shouldn't just say that, I should do it. Because Dungeon World is all about moves and triggers. When this happens, this happens. When I say he disappears into the crowd, there's no stealth checks, there's none of this, none of that. He's gone. He's solid gone. What are you going to do about it now?
It confuses me sometimes, because I will play your games and then I'll read this after the fact and I go, oh yeah, that happened.
Yeah.
But I can never remember whether you actually said it out loud while we were playing or it just suddenly made sense because I'm reading exactly what happened in the in the game that we played.
Yeah. And of course, sometimes the opposite's true because of the virtue of it being a writing thing, is that what can happen is we'll play test the game and I'll go, oh, that cool thing kind of happened spur of the moment. I'll add that as a move when I write this up proper. So sometimes it goes the other way as well in the context of our play tests. I don't remember much about this adventure, to be fair. It was a good introductory adventure, I think. This whole starting point is based on the cracking dungeon starters that I think started with Adam Coble, and I love the idea of these evocative if I'm going to put my fluffy flavor text in anywhere, you stick it at the start and you put in some inciting questions to get started. How do you know the gnome was innocent? Why don't you trust the magistrate? This is you explicitly not railroading the players. You, the GM, explicitly not railroading the players by saying, you know what, I'm not going to answer that question, you're going to answer that question, and then I'm going to riff off of that. So I'm saying that the gnome is innocent, but you're going to tell me how you know that. And you can say anything. You can say anything you want, but you can't say, actually, the gnome's guilty. Right? That's the idea. This is what this is that principle of bring your own ideas comes to the forefront. It's like, my idea is the gnome is innocent because I've got an idea of how that situation might play out. But that situation doesn't resolve in the gnome surviving necessarily, or it might even mean the players might be wrong. Maybe the gnome is guilty, right? And the players have the wrong idea. But in this instance, you're saying, no, you as characters know this gnome is innocent, but you get to tell me how you know that.
Yeah.
And it's not just going to be a history check with a success. You're going to know that. You know that knowledge already. You get that as a freebie. It's up to you to act on that knowledge and do something with it. In Dungeon World, that's all you get to do. In D&D, you might have roles. You might have mechanics that I say adds to the situation, but they might not necessarily do much in principle. This is D&D versus your Dungeon World style games. But that's sort of by the by. And then impressions are also a thing that started appearing. So Marshall, I think, started. So I don't think these are in the Dungeon World book, but impressions are something which appeared in Dungeon Starters and are the backbone of them. A bullet point list, it's like you want it next to your names. You want to have like that, so you're not calling him Dave the Barkeep. You've got a good list of names of whatever for when you need those names. You've got them. Like if I've got, like, you guys are here, right? It's like, right, post-it note there, right? Post like that much of the road space. Post-it note, names. Other post-it note, impressions, right? That's how important they are. Like relative to players seeing my face, that's how important it is. Names and impressions. Have them to hand every time. I often don't, but that's how important.
I'm going to call you out on this. I'm going to say, yes, your impressions, no problem. You've always got them because that's part of your.
I mean, I really don't, but I want you to think that I do because you play in my games, but I really don't.
Okay, when I'm playing your games, that's the impression I get.
Good.
The other impression I get, just as a little backstory, Joe never ever completes a list of names before he comes to a game.
Never. I'm so bad at it. I'm
so bad at it. He pulls so many names out of his arse.
Yeah.
When he writes these up later.
Well, I've got them then. Yeah, it all looks good after the fact. Yeah, but in the moment, yeah, not so much.
The number of times we've had suggestions from players, we've had random generators, just on the fly. His name is. We can hear him typing on.
Type away. Do as I say, not as I do. All right, have a list of names.
Yes.
You could probably make a career as a dungeon adventure writer by just releasing a list of names every month. Maybe, I don't know, but like if you're most of the way there.
Well, no, hang on. I'd subscribe so that I could just have that up on the page while we're playing and suggest those names.
Yeah, just have the Patreon page of a list of names every month, right? Yeah, that's worth a quid. It's so important. It's so important. And obviously, most of mine don't have that, but there were name generators everywhere. Something I can't remember who originally had this idea. I can't remember if it was a tweet or a Google Plus post or whatever. But one thing I do like to use, and obviously is in all of my Patreon adventures in their original releases, but isn't necessarily here, probably will be by the end. I'm going to collate all the names together. If you've bought a product, like Dungeon World was a Kickstarter product, if you bought a Kickstarter or a Patreon or something like that, use the names of the people who pledged.
Yeah.
Every book like this has a list of like, thank you to all of these people, and you've got like 1 billion names if it's a good thing. Look at this. Look at all these names. Look, I got on page... God almighty, here we go. 362 onwards. And also a short list of guild members, right? From page 362 of the Dungeon World Rulebook. You just got pages and pages and pages of them. Kickstarter backers. There you go, pages and pages. I don't think I'm on here, like I said. I don't think I actually backed the original Kickstarter. But,
the other thing that you can do is just find names. I mean, while we're talking about names, and one of the things that Joe and I quite frequently do, and we quite frequently drive a long way to see like family and stuff. And when we're in the British countryside, we'll be driving.
Well, not in the moment, obviously, but in years past, beyond these lockdown years.
I mean, even before we were dating,
we'd
go on road trips and stuff, and we'd be doing backcountry roads in the middle of England, and we'd think, and one of the greatest names that came out of a drive through the countryside was the name Jonathan Longbarrow.
Good old Jonathan Longbarrow, the halfling,
brilliant,
the halfling farmer from Somerset.
Halfling farmer, and it was literally because we drove past a sign that said that it was close to a village called Longbarrow.
Yeah,
and it was just what a perfect
That's a good name, isn't it? Yeah.
And I'm sure there have been other sort of towns and countrysides just come out of that.
And use your own ones. You know, it doesn't matter if you don't live in England. Use your own names of local places, but obviously try and make it that they're not so local that your players will work out where they're from. But you know, most of the people who read this aren't from England. Luckily, my Patreon backers are from all over the world, wonderfully. So my quaint Englandy names that I use when I use them, they're usually just my backyard or whatever.
they're very useful for the sort of traditional settings. But the thing is, if you were doing like a Siberian type adventure or whatever,
then I struggle. Yeah.
Go on Google Maps and scroll in on a random place in Russia. There's a name. There's got to be a name in there somewhere.
That's probably, if I had to guess, and I don't remember exactly, so I do have to guess, that's probably where Nekesti came from. Unless it was just random syllables in my mind. That is probably where the name Nekesti came from. The other names I mentioned, not so much. Nozyad is a Nostromo is a so down here I'm looking at the town of Nekesti. It has oaths to other towns. The oath means it's got it owes like trade market agreements or whatever with these other local locations. They're just names at this point, but a lot of them get built up. The Sanguine Wood is one of them, which is obviously the previous adventure. Although in this context it was the next adventure. Nostromo is just Nostromo, which is the spaceship from Alien. With a different name, because why not? Just call it K. Because I already had an N, because Nozyad was a name I had worked out a little while ago. But Nozyad is a bastardization of the setting of the Legacy of Kain series, an old favourite of mine, of the setting which is called Nosgoth. Now, I'd love to have called it Nosgoth, but I can't because they've already done that one. So I had to find something else. So I was like, so I probably spent an afternoon mumbling just Nozyad, that'll do. There, I probably spent an afternoon not writing anything and doing that. And eventually I got to Nozyad. Now, Nozyad eventually became the capital city. I liked the name enough. And it became the capital city of my Macassan setting, what eventually became my Macassan setting, which we'll come to right now with Ascension Nozyad. So the very next adventure, Ascension Nozyad there is knocking around somewhere. It'll be my published videos. It's not my published one, and I actually can't remember who did it because it was, again, 6 years ago. But someone did an actual play of Ascension Nozyad, which was absolutely fantastic to watch and really, really cool. So that was super cool.
I particularly remember this one as being very, very well done.
Ascension Nozyad is where a lot of these initial ideas started to come together. Now that I think about it, I wonder if the Umberto, I don't know if maybe you did the desert adventure first, then you started doing the Macassa stuff, and then you went to Green Scar, because I feel like by January we weren't doing the Green Scar stuff yet.
Green Scar came a lot later.
Yeah. Bear in mind that the lead time for these adventures is very, very short indeed. We would, at this stage, when things were doing really well, I'd be writing 2 or 3 adventures. We'd be meeting weekly, playing games, and I'd be taking something from almost every session. Only later did I start first curtailing down, so we might be playing 3 or 4 sessions a month, and I might be releasing 1 or 2 or 3 adventures. And then eventually it really just became like 1 adventure a month on average. And then not even that as time went on, and we weren't playing games as regularly, and I didn't want to start making those games about what I wanted to write about this month. So, but at this point, it was very much like, we're going to play a thing, we're going to go to a place called Nozyad, we're going to do this thing, and then we're going to play it out. And there was a certain element of continuity in the context of our playtest group, but not necessarily, that continuity wouldn't necessarily go through to what gets written. The stories are being written from a point of view of a perspective of a new player. And that was the other thing, is that I didn't want us to be doing one-shots all the time. So your characters were going up in level at this point and becoming more and more, and you were getting more used to the system in place and your own social, like whoever we were playing with at the time. So the players weren't new players and the characters weren't new characters, but these are still getting kind of starting to get curtailed down to kind of fit the like new player idea, which isn't so difficult in Dungeon World, but does make it more difficult in D&D. Anyway, that's a little side bit. But yes, like you said, Ascension Nozyad, I think, was one of the first which really had like, so there's the whole, this would have been like 2 or 3 pages of the original kind of oh look, another big block there. That probably means that this was a whole page. That block down there that I'm looking at under the 4th paragraph, that block there probably means that this was a whole page's worth of content, or a whole spread's worth of content, and that was like the next page onwards. So this is probably the first adventure where I've gone from, this is more like a traditional D&D adventure where it's like, okay, you're going to go to the workshop and the workshop has these rooms, and I start doing keys for rooms. One thing I haven't included in any of these is the maps. Honestly, I don't know if you need them. I might have to go back through some of these or go on some, if you feel like they do and you want to send me some feedback, cool. But honestly, most of them were just scribbles. I hate drawing maps. I hate needing to rely on maps. I find it so tedious, especially in Dungeon World. They are a necessity in a lot of cases, but for something like this, it's like, okay, well, you're at this Gnomish Inventor's workshop and the workshop's gone missing. Let's look at the idea. There's a first floor, there's a ground floor, and then there's the basement. None of those are particularly huge. That's really just 3 rooms worth of content, but they're really interesting rooms. So I don't feel the need to say this room is a square room, and this room is a triangle room, and this room has a side room, and blah, 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 blah. I'll let you work on that, players. And there's so many other good people who make amazing maps. Dyson Logos is the obvious one that comes to mind, but there's so many good map makers out there. Why should I step on their toes with my crappy little scrawls? So that's why there aren't many maps in this book.
Well, I mean, I remember probably around this time, because we were largely playing online.
Oh.
You would have a piece of paper in front of you, and you draw something on a piece of paper and then show it to the webcam.
Yeah. And it's something I still do a lot to this day. I'm like, all right, you know what? Like, Roll20 wasn't really. We would just play on Google Hangouts, and it'd basically be what you'd now call theatre of the mind. We wouldn't have any miniatures to hand other than what we might like to paint or something, but even that we weren't doing much of in Dungeon World.
No.
And
I mean, even now,
and we have players. Sorry, Ames, I'm just going to jump in. We also have players in multiple places in England as well. So Tim was playing actively. Anything which is Mercassa related, it's a pretty safe bet that Tim was involved in that. And in fact, now I think about it, Green Scar definitely came after Mercassa stuff, but Green Scar was the second book. So playtest order was Umberto, Mercassa, and then Green Scar. But release order was Umberto, Green Scar, and then Mercassa came later. Because Tim was so closely involved with Mercassa. But I remember that his character, that Templar Logan, went to the Green Scar. I remember that being a thing. So there you go.
Yeah. I can't remember what I was going to say.
Sorry, I jumped in, but I really wanted to make sure that was said because it's interesting.
Oh no, it's about the theatre of the mind thing. So even now when we're playing, doesn't matter what system or because it doesn't matter what system you're playing currently or whatever.
Yeah.
We can't be together. Therefore, we're not playing on a tabletop. We don't need to have miniatures yet. For the last couple of campaigns, we've made well, certainly my last campaign that I absolutely loved the hell out of my character. I had a model made of that character just to have around to visualize what that person looked like in miniature form. It's a very strange thing, but it's something that jumped to my mind because I love that character so much. I had a model.
Of course, the other huge
made for me.
Well, the other huge change in the last 5 years since this came out is 3D printing. So that is, I don't know if it's the norm yet. I can't speak on whether that's the norm. I don't know if that's something that loads of people like to do, but we know enough friends with 3D printers or 3D printing services, and I've got all my Warhammer bits now, which have, I wasn't playing Warhammer at this stage. Warhammer came a couple of years later, and I will talk about that when it comes up. But I don't think it'll come up in the context of what's in the book right now, but it'll probably come up later. So we didn't have lots of bits and models to hand. We weren't really focused in that way right now when we were playing stuff like Extension Nosyiad.
Carry on.
Yeah. Let's move on. Let's see. Aberrant's Eye. Yeah, this is probably, we're now sort of coming to the last of the Mercassa related stuff. Yeah, and we're probably coming up. We're going to carry on a little bit. This might be the last one we talk about, Ames. I think we'll stop after this one. You definitely played him at Aberrant's Eye. Aberrant's Eye was an interesting one where that idea I just said earlier about not wanting maps started to bite me in the arse a little bit, because Aberrant's Eye is like, okay, there's a spoiler alert if you haven't read Aberrant's Eye. There's a crater. I couldn't use Beholder's Eye. Can't call it Beholder because Beholder's copyright to Wizards of the Coast, so it's the Aberrant's Eye instead. That's why it's called what it is. For 50 years, I'm now starting to put in specific bits of continuity. The gnomes of Altai, so now Altai Keep has become the Altai Mountains, and the gnomes live underneath it. So Altai Keep is now somewhere in the region of where all this stuff is going on, albeit on a continent level stage. Even though I'm not drawing a map, and I think by the end of this year, by the end of 2014, I did release a map with it to show where all these places were. For 50 years, the gnomes of Altai and the people of Mercassa have lived together under a cloud of distrust. Only the gnomes know why they fled their mountain homes and have not told the secret to others. Stole that from World of Warcraft. Gnomes fled the gnomes fled, what's it called? Nomagon.
Nomagon. Yeah.
So Aberrant's Eye is basically Nomagon. And the gnomes don't talk about it. Like it's been 50 years. There's a generation of gnomes who have been brought up on the surface as opposed to underground, and the forefathers don't talk about it. There's your core idea here. But here's like, but there's a strange thing. Like in the Aberrant's Eye, so 50 years ago, there's a massive explosion that made like a huge singular eye, like a beholder, but don't call it that because I'll get sued. And underneath it's gone.
I've just noticed one of your the security password is Nomington. Nomington.
Yeah, like New Nomington was the name of the location. It's just New Nomington, not Nomagon. God, I don't want to get sued, but it's Nomington. And it speaks to the silly side as well. It's like, of course the gnomes had a place called Nomington, and again, I don't want to go. I'm going to just say it and then we'll move on. But the idea of like the Nolgi as a species, as a race, maybe in retrospect it was a slightly odd hill to die on, because it's like the gnomes are so specific and not inherently. I don't think there's an inherent negative term. They're endeavors, they're adventurers, they're compulsive maybe, but creative and ultimately like a force for good. Like the positives are spoken of here. So to change that, to retcon that down the line, because I wanted to change that in my books, doesn't feel like it rings so true as it could have done with other more derogatory racial terms that are in other, like orcs and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So there you go, food for thought. But yeah, so the Aberrant Eye as an adventure worked okay in playtest and needed a map, which I didn't have, which was a problem because you've got a sense of scale. So the actual adventure itself is really just getting in there, and then the idea of what's in this whole city, this underground city of gnomes, is not really touched upon other than like the first couple of levels in here. Very little's talked about at all, and it's also one of the shorter ones. Well, it's only one spread here, as you can see.
But there's a lot of, you've got less, and I'm just sort of looking at it visually, you've got a lot less bullet points, a lot of it is more narrative.
A lot less bullet points and a lot more, and the narrative is not big either, and I don't know if that's for the better. I don't know, like looking back at this, like the railway, okay, well the trail ends at the end of a railway, but what does that really say? You know, if I'm being critical of myself, then it's like, well, okay, but what though? Now sometimes that's not the case, because a lot of good stuff that comes out of adventures like this is to give, in Dungeon World you have custom moves. You have, when X happens in play, roll Y, and then this is specifically what's going to happen. Custom moves are a backbone of a Dungeon World specific thing. You could translate into other adventures and they mostly work, but they're very much like a key part of how you would run a Dungeon World adventure. You want to have these custom moves in your back pocket, so that when the players do one specific thing, you can go, aha, like a trap might be a good idea of this, right? Like when the players step on the cheeky the hidden plate, roll plus dex. On a 10+ they avoid most of the arrows. On a 7 to 9 they take some damage from the arrows. On a 6- the arrows pepper them with bullets, and it also summons more bad guys. It's that kind of like idea of keeping these dramatic encounters at the forefront. So realistically, with most of these sections, it's like, okay, well, a vent shaft, what's so important about the vent shaft? Should write a custom move for it. I have done for this one the Archaeatorium. The original use for the room is a mystery, but when you find the emergency generator in it, you can get a few hours life out of it. It helps you. On a 7 to 9, on a 10+, you get the lighting back, at least for a few hours. On a 7 to 9, you get the lighting, but you also get the security systems. So all I've done in there is imply that there's going to be more fighting to be had, but that's okay. That gives you an idea. And then I don't have anything on a 6-. You don't have to when you're writing Dungeon World rules. You can just say on a miss something else happens and it's not good for the players, or you can just leave it off and imply that it's going to be worse.
You don't need to say it. I mean,
no.
For example, like the generator here, generator just doesn't work.
Yeah, you could just say, yeah, although that's not so interesting, is it? It's not so dramatic. But yes, you can start with simply, you don't get what you want, and also something bad happens, right? It comes back to that no but. It comes back to that no but and no and idea, that you always want to be trying to push that a bit further. But yeah.
Yeah.
And then you've got like, there's I mean, this is pretty much just Nomagon. Were we playing WoW at the time? Because this is basically Nomagon. We've got Terranok the Trog. Well, there's Trogs in Nomagon. A savant among Neanderthals. Okay. There you go.
You might have been playing WoW at this point, but I didn't ever really do Nomagon.
So I don't know. Gnomington Arachnodroids. I mean, yeah, there you go.
It depends when this came out, because if it was January, I was doing Panto.
Yeah. Yeah.
So true. You had to find your own entertainment.
Yeah, quite possibly. Yeah, we didn't have enough time at the time. Yeah, this is very much, in retrospect, and I didn't come back to this particularly, and it shows, and that's okay. Like, not all of these are going to be smashing it out the park, and taken as a whole, they're interesting. It's nice to have them all together, to look at all of these together. A lot of the ones I really liked from Mikasa got collected, and that's why that book became known as the Mikasa Chronicles. It didn't get like a clever name or anything, because it really was more, the backbone of it was very much the these adventures we've talked about, and a couple of others which we'll get to maybe next time. plus a little bit of extra continuity and some other fun stuff to tie it all together. Whereas Umberto and Green Scar were especially Umberto, which was done before my Patreon anyway, was written wholesale. It was written as a way to build up my own thinking, my own ideas, and kind of push my own writing. I guess that's how it really played out. Like, chronologically, we did the Umberto campaign. I enjoyed it. I started writing I'm on a Boat. Then I wrote Umberto, Shadows of Umberto. That was pretty much out for Christmas. And then, having enjoyed that, I was like, oh, that's when I started. That's when I came to you the question of should I do this Patreon stuff regularly? Here's how I think it'll play out. You said that sounds great. Go for it. We carried on playing. Our campaign shifted from the Umberto area, the Umberto zone, to the Mercassa zone, and Tim got involved, among others. I think Christian was involved as well. Christian came later, actually, now I think about it, but that's by the by, along with a few other players, certainly. And after Mercassa, so I wasn't writing a book at this point. I was focusing on the Patreon, and it was only by sort of 6 months later, by the summer, if we just jump ahead a little bit, Haven Shine was my first Patreon-specific release. That was someone who pledged a little bit more on Patreon, sent me their ideas, and I wrote an adventure around it. So Haven Shine's a little interesting one. Although in my mind it does now lock back into the Mercassa ideas. Plainarch Vault is the second of the two, which I will probably be going through. I need to ask him, David, if you're watching this after the fact, do you want to come do a thing about the Plainarch Vault, because you paid for this, so it might be a bit of fun. But Plainarch Vault was another very sort of Mercassa-y type one in the end. And then back to the Walls of Nago. Walls of Nago is where it started to come up with it. We'd sort of think Walls of Nago isn't a Mercassa based one, so that kind of ends the end of that little chapter. And then started to talk about forests. Forest one was something to do with Mercassa, but not really. So, and I'll talk about those either with or without David or without Ames. We'll see how we get on. But Aberrant's Eye is kind of the end of that particular chapter of the Mercassa related, and us playing regularly. I think by that point that we'd been playing for a few months. At that point, we played for the best part of a year, all off and on. By the time Haven Shine was being written. We were up to sort of May, and we'd probably been playing Dungeon World all the way through since about, I don't know, June, July of the previous year. Say. Yeah. So we'd got a lot of material down so I'd got a lot of material written down, and you had been my kind of playtest group. Although still the priority was that you were going to be playing, not playtesting. Up to that point.
No. I mean, you mentioned briefly when you were talking about this, and putting it together as a book is a great thing, but just to come back to the beginning of this, I think one of the reasons I recommended we thought Patreon was a good idea at the time was it meant that you didn't have to have that big final product that was, I don't know how long this is, 200 pages.
This book, Patreon's Cookbook is 182 pages.
Exactly.
Well, the last one's blank, but
you don't have to have that 200-page odd thing in order to present it to the market. You don't have to have the Dungeon World book that you make into a Kickstarter.
That's right.
The whole point of this was the fact that you were releasing over stages and seeing. It's not just about the fact that you were releasing to the public. One of the key things that you were getting from Patreon at that time was this content is good, this content is middling, and maybe this content isn't going to work. You could have got that through drive-through by doing small PDFs, but it didn't have the personality that it came with on Patreon.
Indeed.
And it meant that you were writing continually every month.
Yes.
And you had that deadline as a writer, and it wasn't just you saying, I have to do something by the end of the month. It was, right, my Patreons are expecting me to have something by the end of the month. And that's why I recommended to you so strongly. Well, I think you said this Patreon.
I think I came to you with Patreon, but you were aware of it. I think we looked at it together, and I was like, this is interesting. And I think maybe a week later, I was like, you know what, Ames, I've been thinking about this. Let me sit down, let me put it to you. Here's my thoughts. I think it should be a Patreon. I think the Patreon would look like this. I remember being pretty distinct about how I felt it would go down, but I had no idea, and I was scared of whether it would work or not, and what the problems might be. But having sat down and talked through it with you, I realised that any potential problems would be minimal relative to the opportunity of doing it, which is exactly what you just said, Ames. Yeah, I had an ongoing smaller deadline rather than putting all my eggs in one basket and doing another big book and not knowing where that would go.
But that I think is true, and also it allows people to support you on an ongoing basis. You know, with you may have put out something that month that didn't quite fit with the rest of the work, but for that person, for example, that they know that they're getting good content that they can read almost on a regular basis, and that's the whole point with Drive-Thru or any of those other platforms for putting your content out. There's no feedback loop. There's no way of gauging your personality against who you are as a Patreon supplier, if you like. And you got feedback, and you got people to pay for your adventures. They liked the way you wrote, so they said
they voted with their wallets, right? That's the idea. It's like, well, if they like it, liking a Kickstarter, well, if you like it, then you can pay for it, and if you don't like it, then you won't pay for it. No harm done. It's not like there's no that's fine. That's okay.
Yeah, and also a lot of the creators that I support on Patreon, I'm not going to shut them off tomorrow if they do something wrong. No way. But it's like, if they gave me an opportunity to say, right, pay me 20 quid this month, I'll mention you more in a YouTube video, or I'll write this dungeon thing, or I'll design a map that's in the shape of your face, or something like that. If I like their content, I'm going to go, yeah, I'll chuck 20 quid.
Sounds like a laugh. Yeah, go on then. Yeah.
And you're not talking about large sums of money. You're not talking about Kickstarter scales of 60 quid for a book or 120 quid for that perk that you really want.
Yeah.
You know, I sign up to Patreon creators because it's $1 a month. It's $1 out of my wallet.
That's going straight in the pocket of someone who you like and appreciate.
Exactly.
That's the idea. Yeah.
And I think that's probably why I wanted to say that now, is because the whole Patreon situation has really helped you to become the writer that you want to be, and that's bloody fantastic.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's not we're talking about Patreon as a system, but that's to say nothing of the patrons as a group who have come and gone over the years and have for the most part offered very good advice and feedback and lots of likes. There's been plenty. I mean, some people have just been. There's this one weirdo called Amy, I think, she's been subbed since I started, more or less. I don't know why. I don't know what she gets out of it, but whatever.
At one point, I was actually, I think it was $3 a month.
Yeah. Or $3 a release, I think it was.
Oh no, it was $3 a release.
Yeah, because I other than a very short period where I tried monthly, it didn't work out, so I went back to per project. Most people on Patreon do it per month now, but I think mine's almost, like I say, other than with a very short break, it's been per release, which in recent years is like, well, you might have to do $1 per month, might have to do $1 per 3 months at this rate. But back in the day, it was like, oh well, I released 4 releases this month, so that's $4. Thank you very much. Or 12 if you're releasing at $3 per thing. But yeah, the having patrons to help you, having a group, it doesn't have to be patron, but my patrons have been incredibly good, and it's been incredibly fulfilling to have a audience of people who are not actively, it doesn't have to be active, it's just passive. It's nice to know that it's like, well, the patrons have like this and they've gone for that, and that's done all right, and it's just a nice simple thing to give you a bit of a reminder every month that, like, oh, there's people out there who are checking out your stuff and you're getting a bit of feedback. And it doesn't have to, I think nowadays Patreon is a very different beast than it was back in 2014. You can't avoid that. The Patreon now is seen in a different light and is often used in a different light. But back then, and my process for using Patreon hasn't really changed. It's just that, I would think, it's just that people have, the system perhaps changed around me. I don't know. But as far as I'm concerned, it's a nice opportunity for people to throw some love. And if they like it, they like it. If they don't, they don't. But it's a nice way anyway to be like, this is cool, thank you. And that's why I would want to carry on doing it. Yeah, that's it. I mean, that's all there's to say about it, really.
You say that Patreon has changed for you from 2014 through to now. There are people on Patreon who I have been supporting for as long as you. And and the basis hasn't changed.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Still...
I think that if you were motivated to support someone on Patreon maybe 5 years ago, then I doubt that motivation has changed. I think that the changes in motivation, obviously you and I were very, as we've just talked about, we were very interested in what Patreon was and what it really represented from the start. But
we were early adopters as well.
Yeah. And but there's been a lot of occasions where both of us have had to explain what Patreon is to people who didn't know what it was, and why it was, say, different from Kickstarter or just putting a thing out, and what the benefits were of doing it that way. And that has often been a difficult thing to cross because it's a level of uncertainty. Now, over time, that conversation, I would argue, has gotten more difficult, not easier. Because there are more people on Patreon and they're using it for different things and at different levels. So for me, I mean, at its highest, I think Patreon has garnered me something like 100 to maybe 200, maybe 150 actually, probably not even as much as 200. I think the best months have been like something like 150, where I've really pulled out the stops. It's been at the highlight. It would be something, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say it's been my best work even, but to try and put a time on it, like probably somewhere around downstream of Dead Town, Six Flowers, maybe something like that. So something like a year into doing Patreon was where I was really still able to pull out all the stops and really push to make it work. I remember that, like, for example, Downstream of a Dead Town, Tomb of the Golden Child, Wolf of Otranto, and Crystal Fuse, and even The Mansion on the Moors to an extent, or that one kind of bled over to the following month. Those 4 were all 4.5 were all done in October of 2014, I think. So they were all done about a year after I started Patreon. I really tried again. I was like, I really want to do one a week here. And not all of them were play tested in the same way. A lot of them weren't. There's a reason why those 4 don't really fit into the kind of Umberto or Mikasa or Green Scar setting, because they were more Halloween focused. It was October, and I think probably I'd have to go back and check the numbers, but it was about as good as it was going to get. And those ones, it was like I probably pulled in maybe £150, maybe $200, say, from that month. And from there, it's I don't think it's particularly ever been as high as that in Patreon alone. Obviously, the fact that I've got the Patreon as an ongoing thing, and the benefits that those followers have then gone on to buy the books on Drive-Thru RPG or Itch or wherever, is also incredibly useful.
I mean, you could start to talk about
very gratifying.
You know, from that standpoint, you could actually start to talk about the decline of Google
Plus.
Yes. As a system, because that's where the community congregated.
Well, that is very much a to be continued, I think, because that was nowhere near. That came years later.
The point I was trying to make is it allows your followers to still follow you, even though that platform doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
It's a useful tome for that, essentially.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I don't want to go too far in the conversation. I don't entirely agree with that. I'd say, for me, Google Plus, the RPG element of Google Plus was as strong on the last day as it was on the first. Like, right down to the wire, people were like, goodbye Google Plus, cry, sad. And it was sad. It was the end of an era. It was horrible, really, because it was like such an uncertainty. But this came years later. We're talking about 2014. End of Google Plus didn't happen until April of 2018. So that's way off. It was unthinkable that such a platform would disappear in such a way. At that point, we're way off the idea of that. And actually, I think that most people were using my Patreon to simply collect the products. I don't think there was much active discussion going on. I would get emails and I'd get messages on Google Plus, and that's where the content was. That was when the feedback was mostly being delivered to via Patreon. And maybe a year in, you're sort of looking at, okay, so I've got to check my Patreon mails, I've got to check my emails, I've got to check Google Plus, I've got to check Twitter, I've got to do this, got to that. Nowadays, for me personally, because I'm not as prevalent I'm not as not producing as much stuff as I used to, and my words no speak no good so much anymore. Apparently, I haven't pushed the same stuff. Most of my stuff, I would say, is on Twitter. I would say if you want to find my stuff now, most of it is via Twitter. You can still go via on Patreon, and I absolutely love to read stuff that is on there, and I absolutely can. I mean, it's only an email away. I say I've got to go here, there, and everywhere. It's only an email away, so it's not as if I won't read it. I do read all the stuff that comes via Patreon. Twitter, if I can read it, I will read it. If it's on Bebo, I probably won't read it, but who knows? Maybe there's a Joe Banner hating community on Bebo that I've never been aware of, and frankly, I can live without it. But Twitter, Patreon,
at least it's you're getting out there.
Yeah, exactly. At least I'm getting out there. Yeah, no such thing as bad publicity, right?
Absolutely.
But yeah, most of it has come through Patreon in terms of the feedback, and then of course having that as a model has been very useful for me, trying to learn what I'm doing and like, am I going to write a book? Am I going to do this? And I hope that's a model. To end on a positive note, I hope that's a model that even if it isn't through Patreon, maybe it's something else. Zine Quest, Kickstarter's yearly Zine Quest comes to mind, where it's more about producing a smaller product over the course of a specific month. A bit like NaNoWriMo, where it's like, no, we're going to set a goal of doing that. That's another good opportunity, I'd say, if you are looking to get into writing. And I absolutely encourage you to do so. It is super cool. Although you're never going to make your millions off of it, so don't do it to get rich, because yeah, it won't happen. But do it to set up a fun community and have fun with it, and flex that creative muscle, I guess. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And use words.
And to use words more gooder. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah. There we go. So I think we'll call it there on that bombshell.
On the fact that neither of us have a vocabulary anymore.
Yeah, exactly. I think we've talked all the talking we're going to talk about this day.
I'm going to go play WoW.
yeah. Let's just go play World of Warcraft. I'm going to go do Nomagon. It's better than this rubbish. So we finished on Aberrant's Eye. Talk about Havenshire next time. Cool. I'll do another recording. Amy might be here. She might not. But
you also want to see if David's about.
I'm gonna message David. David, you're gonna message me about doing a little one maybe, because I think you definitely got some extra, especially around this time. Talking Google Plus was when. So that's a quick interesting aside, is that David paid his pledge through Patreon, but he found me through Google Plus, and he predominantly communicated with me through Google Plus. Maybe I'll get David on, we'll try and reminisce about that together and try and work out exactly the throughput, because obviously we can't find it now. I can't go on Google Plus and check, but broadly speaking, most of that communication happened through Google Plus, not Patreon. That's a good example of what happened at the time. But yeah, this was 7 years ago now, so who knows what would happen today. But yes, thank you for watching. You can find me on my Patreon, patreon.com/jbinc. You can also find me on Twitter, where I'm twitter.com/something.
JBInc84.
I don't think it is that anymore. I'm on there as twitter.com/home. No, that's not it. twitter.com/@jburnell.
Right.
So you can find me here. Go on, profile page. Thank you. There you go. Find me at jburnell. That's me.
That's not actually come up on the screen.
Oh, my bad. Okay. Well, find me on Patreon. Just find me on Patreon. Or just go on the website. It's all on the website, joebanner.co.uk. Just go to the website. That's easiest. And if you want to pick up the book, it's on Itch.io right now. You'll find links in the doobly-doos and the descriptions and all that stuff. I'll throw them up there later. Especially on YouTube. If you're watching this on YouTube, hello. That's it. Any parting words, Ames?
None from me.
None from you. All right, great. Cool. All right then. Cheers, everyone. See you soon.
Bye.